Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, hello and good afternoon from Jakarta. Welcome to FPCI Group's virtual public forum on Asia's energy security, the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war and the future outlook. My name is Hafiz, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, today's forum is brought to you by FPCI, Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, in collaboration with National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, Japan. Today, I'm pleased to welcome all participants tuning in on our channel from across Indonesia and abroad. We have attendees from Japan, the United States, Philippines, Ghana, Ecuador, Poland, Egypt, and many more. Before we continue, I would like to inform you that we also provide live interpretation from English to Japanese. So if you're joining from Zoom, you can click on the bottom right of your screen for the language options. Ladies and gentlemen, the ongoing war in Ukraine has yielded to a global energy crisis. Having inevitable impacts on the market and the geopolitics of energy, the war in Ukraine has raised intriguing thoughts and questions, which I hope to see in today's discussion. As I'm sure everyone is excited to jump into the discussions, let us begin. I would like to invite Dr. Dino Patijalal, the founder and chairman of FPCI, to give his welcoming remarks. To Dr. Dino, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody to the fourth FPCI GRIPS virtual public forum titled Asia's Energy Security, the Implication for Russia-Ukraine War and Future Outlook. But first, I want to say congratulations to our Japanese friends because you did very well in the World Cup. Top 16, that's really a great achievement, and beating Spain and Germany, that's really incredible.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Hopefully, I'm still praying one day Indonesia will be able to join the World Cup. We have never joined in all these years, but someday I think hopefully that will become reality. Thank you also to Professor Kunihiko Shinoda, Professor and Executive Advisor of GRIPS Alliance, and your team at GRIPS for being FPCI partner for the past years, and special thanks to my good friend Ambassador Yutaka Imura-san for always working with FPCI to arrange good projects. And also thank you for all the speakers, Christopher Len, Pamela Simamora, and of course Toshioki Sukamoto for speaking today. And I want to recognize and welcome 900 participants who are coming from 60 countries, including Indonesia, Japan, US, Philippines, Singapore, East Timor, not East Timor, Timor-Leste, Ukraine, Slovakia, Yemen, Zambia, and many more. And today, Forum has the most registered participants for this year's FPCI GRIPS program. And our discussion today is timely and important, particularly in building energy resilience in ASEAN and East Asia. And as we all know, Ukraine war has affected global energy security and the energy transition agenda. There are four challenges that I would like to highlight for our region in terms of energy security. First, as the economies of ASEAN countries expand, demand for energy has risen while price remain high. In the first 2 weeks after the invasion, the global price of oil, coal, and gas went up by about 40%, 130%, and 180% respectively. And several ASEAN countries are energy import dependent economies such as Singapore, Philippines, and Thailand. And because of this, inflations have risen. It has risen 77.5%, 6.9%, and 6.4% respectively in September for Singapore, Philippines, and Thailand. And secondly, there's a need for energy mix diversification, diversifying the energy mix to reduce reliance on any single source of energy is important feat, and Southeast Asia energies is still dominated by coal, oil, and gas supplied from the Middle East, Africa, and a substantial amount of Russia gas also. Thirdly, the worrying rate of greenhouse gas emission continues to be a problem. In our region, we are still heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and 70% and over 80% of Japan and Indonesia's total energy consumption comes from fossil fuels, respectively. And fourth, limited capability and resources to accelerate the energy transition. Japan has come up with an initiative called Asia Energy Transition Initiative, AETI, which is to support the energy transitions in Asia. It's a very important initiative, and this is mentioned in the joint ministerial statement of the 19th ASEAN Ministers on Energy Meeting +3. And through this program, Japan committed $10 billion in financial support for renewable energy, energy efficiency, liquefied natural gas, and other projects to pursue energy security. And AETI is definitely welcomed by ASEAN countries. Indonesia and Japan also signed a memorandum of cooperation on the realization of the energy transition in January 2022. Indonesia's G20 presidency also yielded fruitful results on energy transition finance in Indonesia. The Just Energy Transition Partnership, for example, co-led by Japan, the EU, and the United States, pledged to mobilize $20 billion over the next 3 to 5 years to accelerate Indonesia's transition of energy. And we are very excited about this new development, and we will do our best to realize this energy transition based on the new scheme. And all in all, today's energy crisis brought us a stronger signal that we cannot rely on fossil fuels in the future, and that transition must be accelerated today. And for this, we need to invest in building the capacity and infrastructure for renewable energy as soon as possible. I hope today's discussion will give us more insight and analysis on how Asia, particularly ASEAN countries and Japan, can cooperate further to achieve sustainable energy security. I wish you all the best and have a good discussions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for your remarks, Dr. Dino. Before we continue the session, let us also hear the opening remarks from Professor Kunihiko Shinoda, Professor and Executive Advisor of GRIPS Alliance. Professor Shinoda, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Pak Hafiz. And Dr. Dinopati Jalal, founder and chairman of FPCI, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you so much for joining us today at the 4th FPCI GRIPS Public Forum, co-organized by FPCI and GRIPS. FPCI and GRIPS have launched joint programs since last year, including public forums on various international issues and the Southeast Asia-Japan Track 1.5 dialogue. ASEAN is one of Japan's most important international partners, and we believe it is very important to promote intellectual exchange between Japanese and ASEAN researchers to deepen dialogue on issues of mutual interest, including politics, economics, and society, and to involve as many people as possible in discussions. In the 4th FPCI GRIPS Public Forum to be held today, distinguished researchers from ASEAN and Japan will exchange views on the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on energy security in Asia and its future outlook. The Russian invasion of Ukraine that began at the end of February this year has disturbed the global oil and gas market and caused energy prices to skyrocket. As a result, many countries are faced with the need to diversify energy sources and secure stable supplies of energy. On the other hand, in order to realize a carbon neutral society, as discussed at the COP, it is also important to accelerate the green transformation, that is, the transformation of economic, social, and industrial structures to be centered on clean energy. In particular, in emerging countries such as ASEAN, it is essential to accelerate the transition to carbon neutrality in a realistic manner, considering the actual conditions of each country in order to achieve sustainable economic growth. In this context, Japan plans to establish an Asian zero-emission community in Asia, including the development of zero-emission technologies, international joint investment in hydrogen infrastructure, joint financing, technological standardization, and an Asian emission trading market. At the same time, Japan is also promoting collaboration with ASEAN countries to strengthen energy security that will support realization of an Asian zero emission community. In today's public forum, I expect experts will engage in a lively exchange of views on how Japan and ASEAN should promote diversification of energy sources and transition to clean energy in order to achieve energy security and carbon neutrality in the midst of the global energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In closing, I hope that the ASEAN and Japanese audience who participated in today's public forum will continue to participate in future events, such as the public forum co-organized by the FPCI and GRIPS. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Shinoda, for your remark. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let us now start today's discussion. Allow me to invite our moderator, Mr. Agus Praditya Tampubolon. He is the Southeast Asia Project Manager from the Clean, Affordable, and Secure Energy at Institute for Essential Services Reform. To Mr. Agus, I yield the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fatila. Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Dinopati Jalal, Professor Kuniko Shinoda, all speakers. It is my pleasure here this afternoon to moderate this session. As the Master of Ceremony has introduced, my name is Agus Tampubolon. I'm currently a project manager for a project called CASE, a Clean, Affordable, and Secure Energy for Southeast Asia. So this topic is really relevant to the work that I'm also managing to my project. Before we go to our speakers, let me start by giving this opening. So many Asian countries relies on fossil fuels, mostly imported fossil fuels, as Dr. Dinopati Jalal has mentioned in the opening speech. These imported fossil fuels are used to fuel the economic growth. However, with the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, this high reliance on the fossil fuel brings several implications. Several has been named, for example, high global energy prices, which also impacted the energy security, high commodity prices, particularly since many countries are starting to recover from the COVID pandemic. And there's also another concern that this crisis brings, which is the fossil fuel infrastructure commitment, so to say, that to cope for the high energy prices, many countries start to boost their own fossil fuel production, for example. So looking at all these implications, we can, looking at the point of view promoting sustainable, we can see that this war can be perceived as a reminder for us that we need to diversify our energy sources and accelerate the energy transition. So this afternoon with me, we have three speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Christopher Len, a senior research fellow at Energy Studies Institute from the National University of Singapore. Dr. Christopher Len, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello, everybody.
Excellent. The second speaker is Mr. Toshiyuki Sakamoto, a board member, the director of Institute of Energy Economics Japan, IEEG. Good afternoon, Sakamoto-san. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Good afternoon, Agus, and good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you for this invitation.
Thank you. Perfect. And our last speaker is Ms. Pamela Simamura, Policy and Advocacy Manager at the New Energy Nexus based in Jakarta, Indonesia. Hello, Ms. Pamela.
Hi, Agus. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
Perfect. Ms. Pamela has excused herself since she's currently in a difficult connection places, so she will turn off her camera for the time being. Okay, I will start with the first question to all the speakers. The first question will be, we have seen that the war bring many negative impacts to the energy infrastructure, to the renewable energy acceleration. But globally, or like based on your experience, your research in your institution, how do you think the war has affected your country or the region energy-wise? And what do you think will happen if this crisis continues for the next year or the coming years? Maybe we can start with Dr. Lam.
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this platform to share some personal thoughts. When we talk about Asia energy security, and of course, the focus today is on the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, I think it's also very necessary to take one step back to set the Asia's energy security in a wider context, right? So actually, the global energy landscape was already fast evolving even before the Russia-Ukraine war, with the global low-carbon energy transition underway. Today, we are already witnessing the structural transformation of the global energy landscape, with Asia as a center for energy demand. So when we talk about energy transition and Asia energy security, the Russia-Ukraine war is the latest episode, but we need to take one step back. And I would argue that Asia's energy transition has already been twice disrupted, right? The first disruption was because of the pandemic, and then now comes the second disruption as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, right? So both episodes offer useful lessons when we look at the kind of the transition that's taking place in Asia, right? So the very first important reminder is the importance of energy access. So going back to the pandemic period, what I noticed is actually unknowingly, a lot of us suffer from what some people have described as energy blindness. I'm from Singapore. We are fairly developed. We have very good infrastructure and facilities, and I'm very thankful for that. But when the pandemic struck, when people got stuck at home, when you needed to work from home, when you needed to attend your classes from home, then access to electricity becomes a problem, right? So this brings to question the topic of the difference between ensuring universal energy access versus sustainable energy access, right? So this is the lesson I took away from the very first disruption because of the COVID pandemic. So the second disruption, which is the latest one, which is the Russia-Ukraine war, I would say that it reminded us the importance of self-reliance when we talk about energy security. There is no energy transition if there's no energy security. So what are the lessons we learned from the latest war? Well, the first one, if we look at Europe, is the danger of over-dependence on a particular supplier. Second one, as we see the war unfold, we also note on the ground the vulnerability of critical infrastructure, right? So, power stations are being hit, winter is coming, people are left without power, and things are very uncertain on the ground. Ultimately, I think what these two episodes have shown us to date is actually the resilience of the governments and society. And here I'm talking in the Asia context. There were a lot of concerns about what the Russia-Ukraine war will entail for Asia's energy security and for the wider economy. But I'm very pleased and surprised to see that, at least for now, our societies are holding up quite well, especially in the energy context. There's a price to be paid, subsidies to be made, resources to be reallocated, but generally, we don't see society collapsing. We don't see widespread protests in the streets because of inflation. These are all issues we have to deal with. But generally, for now, I would say that Asia as a whole has handled the pandemic very well. And with the Russia-Ukraine war unfolding, we have to date managed our energy security pretty well as well. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. Just to follow up a bit on your answers, you've said that Asia as a whole has held up quite well in these two major events, right? The pandemic and also the energy crisis. What do you think as the big factors contributing to why Asia in general has shown a good response to these two crises?
What surprised me is actually the resilience of our societies, and of course the ability of the various governments to handle all these different crises. Of course, there are some, nobody's perfect, and some countries do it better than others, but ultimately, as a whole, I would say that the economy is still moving along. There's a context of a wider global recession. Inflation is here, but generally, we don't see the kind of social unrest that some of the critics or some of the analysts were predicting. I'm not saying it will not happen, but for the time being, I think that there is a certain level of trust and commitment between the governments and the population, and they understand that these are challenges that is outside the control of the respective governments, and this is something that they just have to go through together. I mean, having protests in the street would not bring the price of goods down, for example. There's a time for protests, there's a time to work together, and I think that interestingly, the level of resilience in Asia, and I'm generalizing, of course, is much higher than I expected.
Thank you. Now I'll go back to Sakamoto-san. If you can please elaborate your answer to the first question that I asked.
Thank you for your question. Let me try to answer for both Japan and Asia. For Japan, obviously, Ukraine crisis, we clearly recognized once again importance of energy security. The price of electricity went up by 20 or 30% compared with 1 year ago, and it will further increase. Also, another important event happened on March 22nd in Japan. 1 week before that, there was a big earthquake in the eastern part of Japan, which damaged our existing thermal power plant, gigawatt class. Then March 22nd came. It was very cloudy. It was very cold. The cold weather increased the electricity consumption, but the gigawatt class thermal power plants were not operating. And the cloudy weather, there was a very little power generation from solar power. So on that day, March 22nd, we were about to face the rolling blackout once again in Japan for the first time since 2011 Fukushima accident. So those events, through those events, we clearly recognized once again importance of energy security. And because of that, the Japanese government changed its policy on nuclear. Before 2011 Fukushima accident, there was 60 nuclear power plants in Japan. At this moment, only 6 nuclear reactors are now being operated in Japan. Currently, nuclear power contributes just 6% of our power mix, and our plan in 2030, that contribution needs to increase to 20 or 22%. So this is a very significant challenge for us. Out of 60, 17 nuclear reactors already got approval under the strengthened nuclear safety regulations. But many of them cannot be operated because of a number of issues, including not getting consent from local community, etc. And Prime Minister Kishida this summer clearly expressed his strong will to resume all of these 17 nuclear power plants. And more importantly, he instructed officials to consider the extension of operational life of nuclear reactors. At this moment, currently, the lifetime of nuclear reactor in Japan is 40 years, plus 20 years if approved. And the Prime Minister considered extending further these nuclear power operational life. And even more importantly, he instructed officials to construct new nuclear power plant in Japan, next generation innovative reactors. The construction of new nuclear power plant in Japan has been a taboo since 2011 Fukushima accident. But because of the Ukraine crisis, because of the more recognition on the importance of energy security, the Prime Minister decided to raise this issue. And it turned out to be popular among Japanese people. Majority of the Japanese people, in particular younger generation, are supportive for restarting nuclear power plant and also constructing new nuclear power plants. So that's what happened in Japan. And for Asia, as Dr. Dino pointed out in the beginning, the natural gas price increased and the coal gas increased. This was triggered by Europeans' purchase of LNG, I think. Well, for example, US origin LNG used to be destined to Asia. The 50%, half of the US origin LNG came to Asia 1 year ago. It's now just 23%. So Europe is purchasing LNGs all over the world at much, much higher price. And I heard ministers from ASEAN countries like Thai, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, all say that they would need LNG for energy transitions. So I do believe that a more upstream investment of gas is necessary, and also middle stream or downstream investment for ASEAN countries to utilize natural gas would be needed. Otherwise, many countries will come back to coal. There is some signs in China and India. We calculated India and China's domestic production of coal as well as import of coal and compared 2021 and 2022. Both countries, China and India, increased coal consumption this year. So this may not be a somehow permanent trend unless we increase upstream investment in natural gas. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sakamoto-san. If I can ask a follow-up questions to your answers. You mentioned that Japan has started to look at build a new nuclear reactors or restarting nuclear reactors as well, as I've read, but also investing in gas infrastructures, if I'm not mistaken. So this is to generate electricity, I would assume. How about the other sectors that also requires energy? What is the plan in Japan? How it looks like if Japan wants to reach the net zero in 2050, if I'm not mistaken, for Japan, right?
Yeah, electricity sector, power sector, rather easy to decarbonize. There is a solutions, the renewables and the CCUS, nuclear, etc., etc. What is difficult to decarbonize is the heat use of industry, the steel, cement, and paper and pulp, etc., etc. They need very high temperature heat, which cannot be produced by electricity. So for those purposes, we need to introduce hydrogen or ammonia. So in order to address such hard to abate sectors, we intend to facilitate first research and development. Hydrogen-based steel producing is not commercial at this moment. So first of all, we need to facilitate the research and development. Then we will be investing those technologies. And we have a plan. We will be issuing 20 trillion Japanese yen GX, Green Transformation Transition Fund, a transition bond. The government will be issuing 20 trillion Japanese yen bond to facilitate investment in low carbon technologies. That is quite significant, 140 billion US dollars. That investment, 20 trillion Japanese bond, will lead to 150 Japanese trillion yen investment in total, both for public and private, which is 1.1 trillion US dollars. So that is a plan. We need the research and development, that we need to facilitate the investment, and we need money. And we will be issuing, the government will be issuing transition bond, 20 trillion Japanese yen, which will be repaid by the revenue of new carbon pricing, which will be touched upon later stage in this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakamoto-san. Pamela, can you still hear us?
Yes. Thank you, Agus. Yeah, I think the most noticeable impact of the war for most people is that energy prices are rising. And I think it's also worth noting that it is always the low-income households that are hit the hardest by increased energy prices, as they spend a bigger share of their income on energy than the well-off. And of course, soaring energy prices have significantly increased living costs for everyone. And in the Indonesian context, high energy prices, I think, have increased energy subsidies to a new record. This year alone, we have spent like 520 trillion Indonesian rupiahs, or more or less, it's about like 35 billion USD for energy subsidies. And what's unfortunate is that most, if not all, of these subsidies go to fossil fuels. And specifically for gasoline subsidies, for example, 80% of subsidized gasoline is actually enjoyed by the wealthy instead of the poor. But on the other hand, the war also, I would say, is an opportunity for Indonesia because, as you know, Indonesia is coal, the largest coal exporter actually right now. So when more countries are reopening their coal-fired power plants, of course, it means that coal demand is increasing, and many people in the coal industry in Indonesia is really happy about the situation overall. But of course, the war-induced energy crisis has shown us the importance of transitioning away from fossil fuels. I mean, and although again, Indonesia can reap this opportunity, at least in the short term, I think in the long term, it's still important for Indonesia to transition away from fossil fuels, because I believe every country that is heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels, such as Indonesia, because Indonesia is still importing oil, for example, I think Indonesia will always put itself at risk of an energy crisis that, of course, later leads to an economic slowdown. That's why I think it is really, really crucial that this time we take the energy transition more seriously, because if you look at Indonesia, I think Indonesia is lagging behind Japan and other Asian countries in terms of renewable development and also EV penetration. Because I've looked at the stats yesterday, and it seems that in the past 10 years, we only received like $7 billion US dollars for renewable investments. It's really low, and on average, we only receive like less than $2 billion US dollar per year. It's much lower than what we need to transition the overall energy system, because so many studies show that Indonesia needs at least like a 20 USD per year, okay, per year. So that's why I think Indonesia needs to, to improve the regulatory barriers to attract more investors to come to Indonesia. And of course, in the context of EV penetration, we also still, need to ramp up our EV penetration. Last year, we only saw like less than 1% of EV sales in the overall vehicle market in Indonesia. So again, I think we need to reduce our fossil fuel consumption and increase EV penetration and renewable energy intake to free us from current and also future energy insecurity. And of course, to prevent climate catastrophe from happening.
Thank you, Pamela. You've touched upon some questions that I will actually ask later at the second part. But before I ask another question, I would encourage as well all the participants, if you have a questions, please do type your question in the chat box, and I will read them to the speakers. During our discussion, I've heard several of times the word subsidy was mentioned. So the subsidy was used to ease up the burden of the hike or of the increased energy prices, so that the citizens, so to say, can still enjoy affordable prices of the energy. Do you think, to the speakers, do you think this crisis actually speeding up the global green energy transition, or is it actually bring setback to the global economy that we linger around using fossil still because of the investment in fossil? Maybe we can start with Pamela this time, and then we will continue with Sakamoto-san and Dr. Ren.
Yeah, thank you, Agus. I think in the short term, of course, we have seen a new phenomenon right now, because more European countries are reopening their coal-fired power plants. I recently read news articles about the UK and also France that ramp up their coal-fired power generation. I would say there's also a setback in a way that these countries are always preaching us, developing countries, particularly to transition away from fossil fuels. But on the other hand, they are right now, increasing their coal consumptions. But I would argue that this is only a short-term strategy. But in the long term, I think the energy crisis and the war itself, it will happen. It will help us to accelerate our energy transition, because as you know that the oil and gas prices are soaring right now, and it means that renewable energy become more competitive compared oil and gas, compared to fossil fuels. That's why I think we can see it as an opportunity for us, to transition to ramp up our renewable energy intake, and also to increase our EV penetration in the long term.
Okay, noted. Thank you. Sakamoto-san?
Yes, I very much agree with Pamela. In Japan, the government will be introducing a subsidy for electricity bill. That is quite necessary. As I said, the electricity bill increased 20 or 30% compared with 1 year ago. The government had no choice but to support general public in this regard. But I think this crisis will facilitate our energy transition. As I said, that will facilitate the restarting of nuclear power plant we will be increasing the investment by issuing a transition bond. I do believe that in Japan, the energy transition would be facilitated. As for ASEAN and Asia, I hope that would be the case as well. As Pamela said, in the short term, increased use of coal would be inevitable in many countries, but it has to be a short-term phenomena. But there is a risk that such increased use of coal may prolong to the future, unless, as I said, upstream investment of natural gas is increased. I do believe that the transition to renewable will be happening in Japan as well as ASEAN countries, but there is a clear distinction between Europe and Asia. Japan and ASEAN countries, we cannot enjoy very advantageous natural conditions of renewables, both solar and wind. Our renewable potential is limited compared with European countries. So it's really important to accelerate renewables, but we need to take a bit different pathway to carbon neutrality from that of European countries. That is first, the ASEAN, particularly also Japan, needs to shift from coal to gas. And then we need to decarbonize our fossil fuels by utilizing CCUS and the co-firing of ammonia and hydrogen. So probably Japan and ASEAN countries and Asian countries cannot leapfrog to renewables. We need to use every source of energy resources. As Dr. Dino said in the beginning, 80% of current primary energy supply are coming from fossil fuels. So we need to use wisely fossil fuels. We need to decarbonize fossil fuels, along with the effort to facilitate renewable under nuclear. That's my answer.
Thank you. Dr. Ren?
Yes, I agree with what the previous two speakers have pointed out. And I'd just like to add on the question of subsidies. I guess the subsidies that's being given out by governments these days in the face of rising energy prices is a very short-term and solution to address the immediate domestic pressures that's faced by their own economies, right? So subsidies are okay in the short term, but ultimately the money comes from the state budget. It's a diversion of resources at the end of the day. And in a way, it's also a distortion of the energy markets and also a distortion of consumption behavior, right? And there are so many priorities that the governments are facing right now. Our focus today is on energy security, but before that, there was the pandemic. So there's issue with regards to spending on healthcare. There's an economic downturn that's coming. So government has to plan and address the economic downturn and how it will affect the livelihoods of people. And then you also have wider sustainable development goals, right? Energy access is just one of many. So subsidies would work in the short term, but ultimately, I think the government can better allocate its funding to other more pressing areas. I guess one area where there can be financial support would be in investing in renewable energies. I wouldn't really call that subsidies in itself. I would say that there needs to be more investments allocated for the governments to have a longer term view of ensuring energy security for their population. Thank you.
Thank you. I've seen many questions in the chat, so I'll try to pick some questions from the chat. So the first question came from Edward Olim. So the summaries of the question will be like, countries like China has become more relevant players in the renewable energy sector. And do you think, like looking back at the energy security, do you think this dependency on one country will compromise the regional energy security, particularly for the Asia or Asia Pacific? Anyone from the speakers would like to take this question?
Maybe I can give it a quick shot. I couldn't find the question in the chat, but the basic question is about over-dependence on a single source, right? So as we can see, over-reliance on any single actor is not a very wise thing to do. Sometimes it's not because the actor has bad intentions, but sometimes these countries, these suppliers, they have their own domestic circumstances. For example, I'm not using the example of energy here, but if you look at the global supply chain, when China went into lockdown, a lot of the manufacturing items that were produced in China were disrupted. So I think what we are heading towards is a kind of a new thinking where diversification is the word of the year. You need many sources, you need supplies, supply chains. That supply chains used to be based on just-in-time kind of deliveries, and people are now looking more in ensuring that they have adequate supplies of whatever it is that they need. So we're moving from just-in-time to just-in-case, right? So again, just to summarize, over-dependence on a single country is not a good idea because beyond the economic cost, it may be very attractive in some cases, but there are potential disruptions that may come into play. Thanks.
Thank you. Sakamoto-san, do you want to add?
Yes, I just would like to make a brief comment. Depending on a single source or a single country poses a significant risk. This is the lesson we learned from Ukraine crisis. I heard that in G7 meeting this year, the German delegate said that they made historical mistake in energy policy. That means over-dependence on Russian gas. So we need to diversify, as Agus said. And, but this is the catch-22. There is a trade-off between diversification and economic efficiency, or on-time delivery, etc. This is the case for critical mineral as well. The critical minerals, we have a very limited sources of countries to supply critical minerals. And also when it comes to processing, China is dominant. And we are making every effort to diversify in order to reduce the risk of supply chain disruption. But again, there is a trade-off between diversification and economic efficiency, but we need to pay some cost in order to ensure energy security.
Thank you. Pamela, do you want to take on this or?
Yes, I just want to add a little bit. So I think I agree with Sakamoto-san and also Dr. Rui that I think in terms of over-reliance on one country, it doesn't only apply to fossil fuels because right now, as we see, Europe actually right now is suffering from energy crisis because their over-reliance on Russian gas. But the same thing applies to renewable energy because if we are heavily reliant on supply chain from China, I think in the long term it will be also too risky for all of us. So I think in the long term, every country should set up not only a good energy policy, but also a good industrial policy in the way that we should also develop our domestic um, manufacturing industry, for example, in this case for renewable energy industry, so that we can secure, we can make sure that we will not be disrupted by any kind of geopolitical issues or whatever issues that other countries are currently going through.
Pamela, are you still there?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear
Sorry.
me? Okay.
Yes. I thought I lost you. Okay. Since you're mentioning about that, I just would like to deeper into this, the ability of each country to produce the necessary technologies to produce electricity or to generate energy for their own consumption. In the case of Singapore, for example, can you elaborate more? I mean, like looking at Singapore in terms of the size itself, in meeting the future energy demand, how would Singapore plan would look like to be energy independent from other countries, but also maintaining, reaching the Paris Agreement target, for example?
I guess that question is for me. I don't think Singapore can achieve energy independence. We are a small, resource-constrained country and very energy import dependent. And of course, being urban, city, state, having a secure and reliable energy supply is critical for Singapore's survival and economic competitiveness. So right now, majority of our consumption is through natural gas. We are moving towards LNG, but in the longer term, Singapore is looking at energy imports, specifically electricity imports. Singapore intends to import up to 4 gigawatt of low carbon electricity by 2035. And that will make up about 30% of Singapore's electricity supply. So that import will be coming from our neighbors. That is one. And then the other aspect is Singapore is very interested in hydrogen. So we believe that hydrogen could supply up to half of Singapore's needs by 2050. But I mean, this is depending on the technological developments and the development of other energy sources. So we are also trying to diversify, but Singapore is quite a unique case in this because of our size and because of us being resource constrained. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Len. I'll read another question from the participants, but I will try to add to the question that I've prepared as well, since it can be linked together. So this is about the increase of electricity consumption, basically determined by the increase of the need from the citizens, from the people that lives in the country. How do you think, or like, how do you see the role of energy efficiency in the future? Like, for example, in mitigating this energy crisis, do you see the importance of energy efficiency there? Maybe we can start with Sakamoto-san.
Yes, sure. Energy efficiency. In many countries, I think energy efficiency measures are low-hanging fruit. This is clear if you look at the Repower EU. In EU, in order to reduce the dependency on Russia, they put forward the Repower EU package. The energy efficiency is one of the major pillars. And if you look at the United States, they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which includes a $369 billion package. And 16% of that is for energy efficiency. So even developed countries like EU and US and also Japan, energy efficiency is still important. And in those countries, towards carbon neutrality in 2050, we plan to reduce the final energy consumption by 30 or 40% from the current level. That is not possible for ASEAN countries or developing countries. You need more energy, but you can reduce energy consumption from business as usual. I do believe that there are a lot of low-hanging fruit in developing countries, and that is the energy efficiency is the first fuel. We need to explore that possibility to full extent. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Len?
I don't have that much to add. I agree with what the previous speaker said. In terms of energy efficiency, I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of our use of air conditioning, the kind of equipment we run, and just being mindful of at our local personal level, at the individual level. Of course, governments can have policies, but everybody plays a part, be it the use of air conditioning, to switching our light bulbs to LED light bulbs. So it's very important. It's a low-hanging fruit, and there's a lot more to be done in this area. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Pamela?
Yeah, I totally agree with with both speakers. I think energy efficiency is also is very critical actually, and it's not only for reducing the energy consumption, because currently we are facing the energy crisis, but also for reducing reducing the emissions, carbon emissions from the energy sector. But for the Indonesian context itself, I think it's really, lagging behind other countries again, because energy efficiency, I would say the Indonesian government doesn't really put a lot of attention to energy efficiency. And I would also argue that renewable energy issues are more sexy right now in the eyes of the government compared to energy efficiency issues. If we look at the stats again, the investments in energy efficiency in Indonesia is very, very low. I think it's less than, I think it's only in millions of US dollar per year. And what's happening right now is because the regulatory and policy framework is really unsupportive, I will say. Although, again, I really agree with Samoto-san that energy efficiency is actually the first fuel of energy transition.
Thank you. The next question comes from David Mensa. So the question is, has Russian-Ukraine war punched hole in the world economy? So I think what he means is, has this war disrupted the economy, like the global economy? And if you have, can you share your opinion on this question? Sakamoto-san or Dr. Len or Pamela?
Yeah, of course. This crisis disrupted the global economy in a number of ways. And the first and foremost, the increase of energy price, starting with natural gas followed by coal. And also we need to diversify energy sources, not only gas, coal, probably nuclear resources, uranium as well. It also increased the inflation in many countries, 7 to 10% or something like that. I'm not the economist, but the IMF put forward some figures on the average inflation rate, I think, which is around 7 or 8%, a global average. It's huge. It's quite significant. But we need to learn lessons from this. Again, we need to have diversification. We need to have energy security. And I think we need to have more collaboration among like-minded countries. That is the case for critical minerals. we need to diversify the sources of critical minerals and the location of processing as well. And also, in case of Japan, we intend to import hydrogen or ammonia from the third countries. This is because our renewable potential is quite limited in Japan. So green hydrogen and green ammonia is very costly if they produced within our country. So we intend to import green or blue hydrogen and ammonia. That requires a collaboration with third countries, in particular with ASEAN and the Middle East, wherever. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lin?
Well, I've mentioned the importance of self-reliance as a result of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And I think that sort of a silver lining that came out from this crisis is that it has accelerated the shift away from fossil fuels, with countries looking more seriously, investing more in renewable energy systems as a means to help them diversify and to help secure their own energy systems. We may not see the results right away, but in the medium to long term, I think the results will be quite visible. The whole emphasis on diversification, the diversification of suppliers, diversification of fuel types, and the general direction is towards renewable. So I think that is a good sign. Yeah.
Thank you, Pamela. Do you have anything to add?
I didn't hear you clearly. Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was, has this war between Russia and Ukraine disturbed the global economy, as a general question?
Oh, okay. Well, I think I don't have anything to add on this because the previous speakers have, I think, have explained it perfectly. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So I think we can get a bit deeper now into the next step, like the way forward in shifting from this fossil fuel to renewables. So my first question about this would be like, can you elaborate like a pathway for the energy policy, like a short-term, long-term, in your country, specifically like towards this global carbon neutrality? And if you could touch a bit upon the type of renewables that is potential in your area, I think that will also answer some questions from our audience. Pamela, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. Yeah, I think I can explain this in the Indonesian context. I think in the short term, Indonesia should improve the regulatory and policy framework that is currently a main barrier to energy transition in Indonesia. As you know that we have this huge renewable energy potential actually in this country, particularly solar energy. But what's happening right now in Indonesia is really, I think, it's really bad because solar PV investment is very low and it's lagging behind other countries. And it is because of our state-owned utility, PLN, is really hesitant to integrate this so-called intermittent renewable energy into the grid. And I would also point out that a rooftop solar PV is actually a good strategy in the short term for the government to increase its renewable energy penetration, because by allowing more people, allowing more building owners to install rooftop solar PV, it will democratize the overall energy transition process in the country, and also in a way it's also helping the government to boost the solar PV investment in the country. But right now, again, currently, it's not happening at all in Indonesia. many people complain about the situation because most of the time PLN blocks them to install rooftop solar PV because PLN deems that rooftop solar PV will reduce their revenues. In a way, that's true, but on the other hand, it's also a pity because again, solar PV, rooftop solar PV is really an easy way to transition the power sector, particularly. But in the long term, I think Indonesia should focus on the industrial policy as well. As I mentioned earlier, a good energy policy is of course is really crucial. But at the same time, a good industrial policy is also really crucial, particularly in an increasingly uncertain world right now. So I would say the Indonesian government is going in the right direction right now because the government seems to put more focus on downstreaming the industry, the mineral, the mining industry, and I think this is really good. This is really strategic. But in the long term, we need to to put more focus on other, not only the critical mineral mining industry in Indonesia, but also for the renewable energy. For example, solar PV modules. I would argue that we need to start developing this industry back home, because again, if we want to transition away from fossil fuels, I think solar energy is the key for Indonesia. And if we have to import a lot of solar PV modules from China, for example, I think in the long term it's not a good thing for Indonesia. That's why I would recommend the government to start, developing the domestic renewable energy technology, or in this case, solar PV industry in Indonesia. Of course, we need to learn from other countries. I think Sakamoto-san mentioned about the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, which is very good. I think Indonesia should also replicate the same thing here by setting up an industrial policy that we can use to stimulate the economy, but at the same time we also will accelerate the energy transition by developing renewable energy industries back home. Right now, that kind of policy is still absent in Indonesia, unfortunately. And I would say there's so much homework right now in Indonesia. But I'm still optimistic. There will be some changes in the future. But again, we need to put more pressure on the government to make things get done. I think that's all from me.
If you could add a little bit, Pamela, like what will be the short term, in your opinion, what will be the long term? Just briefly, if you could add.
Yeah. Well, I think I have mentioned that earlier. I think in the short term, we should improve the regulatory framework. In a way, we need to attract more investors to come to Indonesia, because currently investors are in the mode of wait and see, because they don't really see any major changes in the Indonesian energy sector right now. Although recently the president actually enacted the presidential regulation on renewable energy tariffs, but the tariffs themselves are not really attractive at all, actually. So there is mixed reactions to the recent government's policy. That's why I think we need to improve that situation. And in the that's for the short term. And meanwhile, for the long term, again, I would emphasize the importance of setting up a good industrial policy, because again, we cannot put ourselves at risk by heavily relying on other countries to supply renewable energy technologies for Indonesia in the long term.
Thank you, Pamela. Dr. Len, and if you and also Sakamoto-san later on could add a bit about the potential of the solar PV rooftop in your respective countries. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so solar. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, Singapore is a small resource constrained energy import dependent country. We are very small, so there are no big rivers. So hydroelectricity is out. Wind, not strong enough, so we can't have wind power. Tidal, we have very busy waterways, so not very practical in the context of Singapore. So that practically at this point in time leaves us with solar energy. And this is something that our government is currently focusing on a lot. So it has started moving to generate at least 2 GW of solar energy by 2030. But to be honest, it's still a very, very small fraction of what Singapore actually needs, right? But we are still trying to make an effort, and this to demonstrate to the wider world as well that we take our renewable, the climate change very seriously, and we are trying our best to show that we are doing our own energy transition. And Singapore, we have this thing called Singapore Energy Story. So it focuses on 4 supply switches for the power sector's decarbonization. So the government talks a lot about the use of natural gas. As I mentioned earlier, the use of solar power, the emphasis on regional power grids. That's something that's looked into very seriously, as I've mentioned earlier. And then also looking at technology, looking at emerging low carbon alternatives. What is out there in the foreseeable future holds promise, and hydrogen is one of them. And in the wider context beyond energy security, our government is also quite focused on the notion of sustainability. So we have this thing called a Singapore Green Plan. There are a lot of details to it. I don't want to go too much into them, but kind of there are about 6 pillars. One is the emphasis about city in nature. So the government wants to ensure that Singapore has green, livable, and sustainable homes for Singaporeans. There's a talk about sustainable living. So they want to strengthen green efforts in schools, in communities, and then to cultivate a green mindset among the citizens to reduce waste and consumption. Then there's what we call the energy reset. We are looking at cleaner energy vehicles, greener infrastructures and buildings, sustainable towns and districts, use of green energy. And then beyond the use of energy itself, there's also talk about a green economy. Singapore is trying to create more sustainable sustainability jobs as an engine for growth, right? And there's a lot of new investments to be carbon and energy efficient. And then there's also talk about a resilient future. It's about safeguarding our coastlines against rising sea levels, because Singapore is an island. Sea level rise poses an existential threat to Singapore. And then we also talk about safeguarding our food security with climate change affecting the production of food. Trying to keep Singapore cool, because Singapore is an urban city. So urban heat is a big issue, and the government is trying to find ways to cool the urban areas down. And then finally, there's the emphasis on green government. So the best way to demonstrate commitment is by having our government demonstrate their own efforts. So the public sector has a number of initiatives to demonstrate sustainability. I don't go into all the details, but I would say that Singapore has quite a holistic plan in terms of securing its energy security and in terms of trying to push forward a sustainability agenda. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Len. Sakamoto-san?
Yes, let me first answer your question on solar or other renewables in Japan. The renewable is very important for Japan as well. Renewable currently contribute 18% of our power mix. And our plan in 2030 is to increase it to 36 to 38%. So we will be doubling the power generation by renewables towards 2030. But Japan is a very mountainous country. We have very limited flat area. If you calculate solar panel installation per flat areas, that figures is the Japan is the highest. You may consider that Germany is a green country, but when it comes to solar panel installation per flat area, Japan is the most advanced, which means, we have developed much of the capacity of PV installations. But again, we will be making every effort to increase the renewable contribution. And back to your question, the path to new energy policy to achieve short-term and long-term goals. Let me address first short-term. In Japan, as I said, restarting nuclear power plant is a very good short-term solutions. Restarting existing nuclear power plant would be the cheapest way to produce low carbon electricity. And when we look at ASEAN countries or globally, I think short term, as I said, energy efficiency is very, very important. And also, in order to facilitate switch from coal to gas, I do believe that upstream investment for natural gas is still necessary and should be facilitated by international support. And for the long term, I would suggest to ASEAN countries that the roadmap for carbon neutrality be developed. Dr. Dino in the beginning mentioned 80 Asia Energy Transition Initiative. This is a Japanese government initiative to support energy transition in Asia, in particular ASEAN. It has 5 pillars, and the first pillar is first and foremost to assist developed ASEAN countries develop their roadmap for carbon neutrality. And my institution, Institute of Energy Economics Japan, together with AREA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, are assisting to develop the roadmaps for carbon neutrality for each of 10 ASEAN countries. We are using an economic model that is to minimize the total energy system cost towards carbon neutrality. I think if we have such roadmaps, that could help you develop industrial policies as well, which was mentioned, Pamela. And I believe that's a very, very good point and important. And also for long term, the carbon pricing would be important for Japan and the ASEAN countries as well. As I said before, Japan will be belatedly introducing carbon pricing, both emission trading and a levy on carbon. As I said, the Japanese government will be issuing 20 trillion Japanese yen bond, but they have to be paid back in the future. In order to pay it back, we need revenues, and the carbon pricing would create such revenues. And in ASEAN, Singapore has already put in place carbon tax. The rate will be increased towards the future. And Indonesia developed a legal framework for cap and tax for coal thermal power plants. And also Vietnam developed a legal framework for domestic emission trading. I think for longer term, carbon pricing would be a very important policy tools for both Japan and ASEAN countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakamoto-san. We have around 5 minutes left in our discussion sessions. Maybe before we close, I would like to apologize to all the participants. If you have a question, please do type, since we cannot accommodate if you ask the question directly. And there are still many questions left and unanswered. But before we close, I would like to get, since the title of our discussion is about the future outlook of the Asia energy, if you can give a close statement in terms of how do you see the future outlook of the clean energy in Asia as a general, or in your country in particular? That would be wonderful. Maybe we can start with Dr. Len, followed by Pamela, and then we'll be closed by Sakamoto-san. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question again?
If you could please explain or elaborate, how do you see the future of the clean energy outlook in Asia as general, or in your country in particular?
Well, I think looking at, I'll speak about Asia. I think that we see a number of drivers of change for the Asian energy transition, right? There are the old players, the fossil fuel exporters, but we see new actors and new technologies. So there is momentum towards renewable energy there. We see new connectivity trends. The world, and hopefully the region, is moving towards electrification. So we will see more cross-border, transnational and trans-regional infrastructure development. And then we also will see more resource flows, new resource flows, right? With the shifting global value chains, different types of resources coming up, different suppliers, different importers. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think the new mindset today is that there's a new preparedness in anticipation of disruption. So there's a cost issue there, but I think the government is very much focused on concerns over reliability. So the market will still work, but the government will have a bigger role to play in managing energy security of the different countries. And of course, with all this, we have also been witnessing kind of new challenges in the geopolitical space. There's this new round of clean or green energy diplomacy. We see it among with the Americans, with the Japanese, with the Chinese. I wouldn't say that they're competing, but I would like to see more collaboration between these major actors so as to avoid duplication of resources, to have a better coordination of their investments, so that there can be a more holistic view of development of the Asian region. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Len. Pamela, Simamura?
Yes, thank you, August. I think for Indonesia, I would split between the power sector and also the transport sector. For the power sector itself, I think if the current trend continues, the outlook is not so good because, as I mentioned repeatedly, that the policy and also regulatory framework is not that supportive. And we need to change that, of course. But again, it's really hard to predict the future because Indonesia is, well, in 2 years we are going to have like the presidential elections, and anything can happen, you know. So it's really hard to predict. But I would say if the Indonesian government next year will make major changes, I think the trend, of course, can turn around. And for the transport sector, I think it's better than the power sector because recently the government announced that they will provide some kind of subsidies to purchase electric vehicles. For example, for electric motorcycles, the government will subsidize around $400 for each vehicle, which is really good, you know. So I would assume that next year the EV penetration will increase, you know, due to these subsidies. But in the long term, I would say is still optimistic. The outlook is still optimistic because the Indonesian government definitely is already committed to climate target and net zero target by 2060 or sooner. And also with the help of the international community through many partnerships with the US, with Japan, and other developed countries. I think it also helps a lot, in a way that Indonesia can accelerate its goal to phase out coal, for example, and also to increase the renewable energy investment and also other clean energy technologies in the future. And I think last thing, because currently I'm working in the startup world, I would also mention that Indonesia needs to increase its spending on research and development. If Indonesia wants to be the EV hub in the region, for example, I think it's really unavoidable, to do some kind of research and development, at least in the context of EV or electric vehicle technologies. But unfortunately, the government again hasn't put a lot of attention to this specific issue, and I would recommend the government to change that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Sakamoto-san?
Thanks. Thank you for asking an important question on future clean energy outlook. I think our goal is common, that is carbon neutrality. But the pathway to reach carbon neutrality is very different among countries, depending on the national circumstances. So that's why I suggested that each country develop its own roadmap to carbon neutrality, how to achieve carbon neutrality that reflect that national circumstances. I think Christopher mentioned a very important keyword, connectivity. I think that is a very important concept towards the future international cooperation. We need to develop the new supply chains for hydrogen and ammonia or other low carbon fuels. And also we need to develop new supply chain for critical mineral exploration as well as for processing. So all these are, related to connectivity among countries. I think we need to develop new connectivity that is quite different from that we developed for fossil fuel in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. With this, I think we actually exceed 2 minutes of our given time. So I would like to thank once again all the speakers for your valuable insights and also time. And I will return the session back to Mr. Padilla. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Mr. Agus, and also all the panelists for the very productive session today. Also, thank you to all the participants. We received over 900 registrations from over 60 countries, with over 300 participants joining live through our Zoom and also YouTube channel. I believe all that are tuning in here today have had fruitful discussions and also gained new knowledge from our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, sadly, this marked the end of the FPCI Group's Forum on Energy Security in Asia. Today's event is available for a rewatch on FPCI YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Thank you once again, everyone, and see you at our next event.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you, Mas Agus.
Sama-sama, Pak.
Christopher, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you, Dr.
Sakamoto-san.
Dino.
Thank you, Dr.
Professor
Ren.
Shinoda.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Agus.
much.
Thank you, Imura-san.
Thank you, Dino-san.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, Pak Dino.